Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a truly fascinating macro to micro journey. We are going to trace the exact step-by-step dominoes that led to the total collapse of a democracy and sparked the most devastating conflict in human history, World War II. It's a massive story about economic disaster, crazy constitutional loopholes, and some absolutely catastrophic diplomatic miscalculations. So let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, WWI and the Versailles fallout. Second, the birth of Nazism. Third, the fall of democracy. Fourth, rearmament and expansion. And finally, number 5, the brink of war.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, WWI and the Versailles fallout.
To really understand how the world caught fire in 1939, we have to start at the ashes of the First World War. And our story begins on a very micro level. Think about a young man born on the Austrian-German border. He's a twice-failed art student, orphaned at 18, and essentially scraping by on the streets of Vienna. When World War I breaks out in 1914, Adolf Hitler actually finds this twisted sense of purpose as a messenger in the German army. But then comes the sudden German defeat in 1918, and it completely radicalizes him. Like so many returning soldiers, he just couldn't comprehend the loss. Instead, he eagerly bought into this totally false stab-in-the-back myth, this unfounded conspiracy theory that blames socialists and Jewish people for betraying the military from the inside.
Now zoom out to the macro level. The sheer scale of the economic burden placed on Germany by the 1919 Treaty of Versailles was mind-boggling. 132 billion gold marks. To put that into perspective for you, that's roughly equivalent to 200 trillion modern yen. It's just an impossible number. Plus, Germany was stripped of 10% of its land, all of its overseas colonies, and its military was practically dismantled. This created an inescapable atmosphere of desperation and intense national humiliation.
Moving right along to Section 2, the birth of Nazism.
So how did this intense national despair become the perfect breeding ground for political extremism? Well, Hitler was initially sent by the military to spy on this fringe political group called the German Workers' Party. But instead of just spying, he ends up taking it over. He realized he had this singular, incredibly powerful talent for public speaking. He could captivate crowds with a really volatile mix of anger and scapegoating. He molded the party, which was soon renamed the Nazi Party, around a rigid 25-point program. This strategy was highly calculated. It explicitly targeted different groups by promising to crush socialism, defining national citizenship purely by blood to exclude Jewish people, and aggressively expanding borders to unite all German speakers.
By 1923, the economy went from bad to an absolute disaster. When Germany defaulted on those massive reparations we talked about, France actually sent its military to occupy the Ruhr industrial region. And the German government's response? To pay their striking workers, they literally just printed more money. That triggered hyperinflation so severe the currency became basically worthless paper. Imagine your entire life savings just vanishing overnight. People were literally giving stacks of cash to their kids to use as building blocks. The middle class was utterly wiped out, which massively accelerated their distrust of the moderate government.
Riding this massive wave of public anger, Hitler attempted an armed takeover in Munich in 1923. The famous Beer Hall Putsch. It was a complete and total failure. It landed him in prison, which is where he wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf. But, this failure was a huge turning point. He realized, okay, seizing power by force, that's not going to work. He had to pivot. The new strategy was to play the democratic game, win elections, and legally subvert the republic from the inside out.
That brings us to Section 3, the fall of democracy.
Let's look at exactly how the Republic's vulnerabilities were exploited to dismantle democracy itself. In the late 1920s, the economy had actually stabilized a bit, and the Nazi Party was really struggling to get votes. They were a fringe group. But then, the 1929 Great Depression hit. American loans dried up instantly, and German unemployment absolutely skyrocketed. Desperate, terrified voters abandoned moderate politicians in droves and flocked to extremist promises of stability. By 1932, this once fringe group had surged to become the largest party in the German parliament. It's a huge shift.
But how did this system actually break down? Well, the dark irony here is that the Weimar Constitution was actually one of the most democratic in the entire world, yet it contained a fatal poison pill, Article 48. This was a loophole that allowed the president to issue laws without parliamentary approval during a crisis. As the Depression worsened, President Hindenburg started ruling almost entirely by these emergency decrees. So long before Hitler even took office, authoritarianism was already being completely normalized and the democratic parliament was being sidelined.
Thinking they could control him, conservative elites convinced the president to appoint Hitler as chancellor in 1933. And almost immediately, 3 exact steps destroyed the republic. First, a fortuitous arson attack on the parliament building, the Reichstag fire, was exploited to whip up mass panic. Claiming a communist uprising was imminent, civil liberties were suspended. Step 2, 20,000 political opponents were arrested. And finally, Step 3, through heavy intimidation and a backroom deal with the Catholic Center Party, Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act. This legally granted him absolute dictatorial power. Democracy was officially dead.
Let's dive into Section 4, Rearmament and Expansion.
So what happens when a totalitarian regime reorients its entire state toward a single catastrophic goal? The data here is honestly shocking. Under the guise of economic recovery, the regime secretly shattered the Versailles Treaty. They used these dummy shell companies called MIFO bills to hide massive debt from the international community. Through this, they funneled a staggering 74% of state funds into illegal rearmament. 74%. The entire economy was functioning on a massive deficit, basically banking on future military conquest to pay the bills.
Now, you often hear people mistakenly praise the economic recovery of this era, but we have to deconstruct this so-called economic miracle. It was a carefully crafted facade. Unemployment dropped dramatically, sure, but not because of brilliant policy. It dropped because the state simply conscripted millions of young men into the military and legally forced women out of the workforce entirely. They also stole credit for public works projects like the Autobahn, which were literally planned by previous governments, and pushed initiatives like the Volkswagen just to placate the public.
And while the military was expanding, the regime heavily accelerated its domestic persecution. Dictatorships almost always require an internal enemy to unify against. In 1935, they passed the Nuremberg Laws. These laws systematically, and frighteningly, entirely legally within this new system, stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. It barred them from schools, voting booths, and basically all of public life. It was a cold, calculated, state-sponsored dehumanization that laid the groundwork for the absolute horrors that were to come.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the brink of war.
Let's look at how the international community responded to all this aggression, and how their desperate desire for peace ironically guaranteed a massive conflict. Hitler constantly tested the waters of international law, and the dominoes fell fast. In 1936, he marches troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. Britain and France? They do nothing. Emboldened by this, in March 1938, German forces crossed the border to annex Austria. Again, zero military opposition. Realizing the democratic powers were deeply traumatized by WWI and terrified of repeating it, Hitler instantly sets his sights on his next target, the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. This leads us right to the defining diplomatic failure of the era: appeasement. Desperate to avoid another global slaughter, Britain, France, and Italy held a meeting with Germany in Munich. In what was a stunning betrayal, they agreed to just surrender the Czechoslovakian Sudetenland to Germany. And the craziest part? The Czechs themselves weren't even invited to the meeting that carved up their own country. The democracies gave up a vital, heavily fortified region, just hoping to satisfy an appetite that was completely insatiable.
And this brings us to one of history's most tragic ironies. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns to London, literally waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler, declaring he had secured peace for our time. He truly believed that yielding territory had worked. But Hitler? He viewed these concessions purely as a sign of pathetic weakness. He had absolutely no intention of keeping his word. In fact, he was already planning the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Meanwhile, back home, the regime's domestic violence was spiraling completely out of control. In late 1938, using the assassination of a diplomat as a flimsy pretext, the state orchestrated Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. This was a massive, nationwide terror campaign. Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues were burned and destroyed. And in a final, unbelievably cruel twist of state power, the government forced the Jewish victims to pay a collective fine of 1 billion marks for the destruction of their own property. As the 1930s drew to a close, the final geopolitical board was totally set. The totalitarian powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan united into a formal axis. Meanwhile, the democratic allies, Britain and France, were left hesitant and playing defense. Crucially, Britain failed to secure a strong alliance with the Soviet Union. Why? Well, largely because they secretly hoped the Nazis and the Soviets might just fight and destroy each other. This hesitation was a monumental miscalculation that would prove incredibly costly. Finally, the breaking point arrives. Overconfident from years of facing absolutely zero consequences, Hitler demands territories in Poland. But the political calculus had finally, irreversibly shifted. Realizing appeasement was a total failure, Britain draws a hard line they can't retreat from. They guarantee they will defend Poland's borders militarily. Hitler, assuming they'd just back down like they did in Munich, orders the invasion anyway. The inevitable clash was set, and the world plunged into war.
Which leaves us to reflect on a really crucial question. As we've seen in this explainer, the collapse of Weimar democracy wasn't some sudden accident. It was a deliberate, calculated dismantling fueled by economic despair and exploited political loopholes. But equally important was the utter failure of the international community. So it forces us to ask, can making concessions to an aggressive power ever actually prevent a conflict? Or does it merely delay the inevitable and drastically increase the ultimate cost of inaction? Thank you so much for exploring this vital, incredibly heavy chapter of history with me today.